Okay, so in the last class we looked at the section in which Heathrow Day describes how gold, silver and precious gems are looked upon by the utopians. The next part, the next discussion is about education and philosophy in utopia, and this section is very interesting and important because we know about the importance of education for the humanists, and from this we also get an idea about what more thought was, wrong or right about the education system. But like as with respect to other representation of the utopians in other fields of life, in the fields of education and philosophy also, More's description of the utopians is not exactly meant to be the ideal, but we have to guess that some of it were approved by him, some of it was disapproved by him. So let us look at this discussion. This is page 84 in my edition. So we have already seen that learning was limited for only some people who were exempted from manual labor, and others, they could pursue learning if they wanted or attend to lectures in their leisure when they were free. These and such like options have they conceived partly by education being brought up in that commonwealth whose laws and customs be far different from these kinds of folly, and partly by good literature and learning. So the folly that we see in other societies, that is not there in utopia, and the high value they place upon learning. For though there be not many in every city which be exempt and discharged of all other labors, and appointed only to learning, that is to say, such in whom even from their very childhood they have perceived a singular towardness, a fine wit, and a mind apt to good learning, yet all in their childhood be instructed in learning. So only those who have shown an inclination for learning from their childhood, they get this opportunity. And the better part of the people, both men and women, throughout all their whole life, do bestow on learning those spare hours which we said they have vacant from bodily labors. They be taught learning in their own native tongue, for it is both copious in words and also pleasant to the ear. So utopians are taught in their native language. Probably this was criticism of many European states where learning was carried out in Latin and not in the vernacular, and therefore we see more sympathy or support for vernacular education. Now, which philosophers they studied and which they did know about, we get a discussion of that. Now, you may know that in Renaissance philosophy there were two kinds of philosophy: natural philosophy and moral philosophy. By natural philosophy they meant the natural sciences, which was not insignificant because of the emphasis on the study of natural sciences by Aristotle and others. And moral philosophy was very important. The emphasis on moral philosophy could be found in Plato, in Aristotle, and in the Stoics. And in general, in the Renaissance, we may say that the philosophical tradition, in the philosophical tradition, there were three dominant schools: Stoic philosophy, Epicurean philosophy, and skepticism or skeptic philosophy. So we see in this discussion among the utopians Epicurean philosophy, there is a lot of discussion on this. Many tenets of the Utopians are found to be the same as those of the Stoics. So we may say that they pursue a kind of a blend of Stoicism and Epicureanism, which would suggest that More did not support only one school of philosophy but found something good, something useful in both these philosophical traditions. Of all the philosophers whose names be here famous, before our coming thither, not as much as the fame of any of them was come among them. And yet in music, logic, arithmetic and geometry they have found out in a manner all that our ancient philosophers have taught. Here the idea, Raphael expresses the idea that even before we came to Utopia and the Utopians could know about Greek and Roman philosophy, even before that they had already discovered most of the important philosophical tenets or philosophical beliefs which is based on a belief that learning could be pursued or knowledge could be ascertained or amassed even without the intervention of God's grace. So it was an idea popularized by St. Thomas Aquinas because the Christian fathers coming down from the Roman times, they had to rationalize the philosophy of the Greeks. How could the Greeks attain at their philosophical knowledge? Because they were not Christians. So without God's grace, they could attain some height of knowledge. And therefore, in Aquinas we find this concept, and here the same idea is used that even though the Utopians were pagan, non-Christian, even then they could amass a certain modicum of philosophical knowledge. But as they in all things be almost equal to our old ancient clerks, so our new logicians in subtle inventions have far passed and gone beyond them. So ancient clerks, that is ancient writers, and here we find a criticism of scholastic philosophers who are described as the new logicians. So as opposed to ancient Greek philosophy, the scholastics of the Middle Ages, they were mostly European scholars. The most famous of them were from England and from Oxford, like Duns Scotus. You find a reference to the philosophy of Duns Scotus in John Donne's poetry also. So the scholastic philosophers, they were often criticized by the humanists because of their subtlety. Their theories were very subtle, abstract, and we find Erasmus criticizes them in The Praise of Folly, and in this book More also criticizes them. So the Utopians could attain the kind of philosophy that we see in our Greek philosophers, ancient philosophers, but they could not surpass the scholastics in their subtleties, suggesting that scholastic philosophy was vain and the Utopians did not practice that kind of vain philosophy. For they have not devised one of all those rules and restrictions, amplifications and suppositions very wittily invented in the small logicals, which here our children in every place do learn. Small logicals is a reference to the books on logic which had the name Parva, means small. So the small logicals or the small logical books, and the most prominent scholastic logical book that was studied in all the schools was that by an author called Peter of Spain. So here probably More alludes to this book and other scholastic books and their theories of restriction, amplification, supposition, etc. Furthermore, they were never yet able to find out the second intentions, in so much that none of them all could ever see man himself in common, as they call him, though he be, as you know, bigger than ever was any giant, and pointed to of us even with our finger. So the theory of second intentions we find among the scholastic logicians. The second intentions were complete abstract concepts based on the first intentions, which were concepts based on our apprehension by the senses. But the second intentions, they are not based on any of our experiences, but on abstract theorization. And hereby the man himself in common, which phrase is sometimes translated in other editions as a man in general, by this phrase More is alluding to the concept of universal man, which was a logical concept, and says humorously that even though such a man could be pointed out as a giant in front of our eyes and with our fingers, he is pointed out, even then some of us, we cannot see him. Why? Because universal man is a concept, it is an abstract idea, and therefore it is not possible to see him. And the utopians, they did not theorize in such manner as universal man, as generalization, which we find in Aristotle. But the utopians were very good in astronomy. They be in the course of stars and the moving of the heavenly spheres very expert and cunning. They have also wittily expurgated and devised instruments of diverse fashions, wherein is exactly comprehended and contained the movings and situations of the sun, the moon, and of all the other stars which appear in their horizon. The utopians practiced astronomy, which was always hailed as a great science, and even in the Renaissance, the humanists, they praised astronomy. But here we find a criticism of astrology. So astrology was also a discipline which made predictions based on the movement of the stars, but it was often looked upon as pseudoscience. But as for the amities and dissensions of the planets and all that deceitful divination by the stars, divination means making prophecy, foretelling, they never as much as dreamed thereof. Amities and dissensions of the planets, that is, whether the planet is in harmony or they are in opposition, these predictions and the prediction of the future based on the position of the constellations, that is astrology, this the utopians did not know. So it is a criticism of the practice of astrology in the Renaissance. As you may know that in the Renaissance, the line between science and pseudoscience was not very clear, and therefore people who practice astronomy, many of them also believed in astrology. And we find an expression of this belief in astrology, in predictions based on the star, frequently in Renaissance literature. In King Lear, for example, we see that the character Gloucester, he is superstitious and he believes in predictions and the evil impact of the eclipses and so on. And they never as much as dreamed thereof. Rains, winds and other courses of tempest they know before by certain tokens, which they have learned by long use and observation. That is, some kind of weather prediction was possible for them, which was however a scientific practice. Of the original beginning and nature of heaven and of the world, they hold partly the same opinions that our old philosophers hold, and partly as our philosophers vary among themselves, so they also, while they bring new reasons of things, do disagree from all them, and yet among themselves in all points they do not accord. So just as among European scholars there are many opinions regarding the cosmological system, during the Renaissance we know that the Ptolemaic cosmology was challenged by the recent discoveries by Galileo, Copernicus and others, and so this new cosmology was creating, we may say, a kind of an intellectual havoc, because intellectuals, writers, they were kind of forced to accept one or the other, as they were as at that time the strict division between science and arts were not there, and that is why we see in John Donne's poetry a lot of allusion to the new cosmology which disturbs the previous world order. In that part of philosophy which entreated of manners and virtue, so after discussing natural philosophy, now Raphael speaks about moral philosophy. Their reasons and opinions agree with ours. They dispute of the good qualities of the soul of the body. Dispute here means discuss. Good qualities of the soul, of the body and of fortune, and whether the name of goodness may be applied to all these or only to the endowments and gifts of the soul. So here is an allusion to a contemporary intellectual debate whether goodness was of three types, that is of the body, of the soul and of fortune, or only goodness of the soul was there. So this intellectual debate is there also among the utopians. They reason of virtue and pleasure, but the chief and principal question is in what thing, be it one or more, the felicity of man consisted. So the chief dispute or the chief intellectual debate was about man's happiness. Felicity means happiness. But in this point they seem almost too much given and inclined to the opinion of them which defend pleasure, wherein they determine either all or the chiefest part of man's felicity to rest. So here is an allusion to Epicurean philosophy. Epicureanism. Now Epicureanism, named after Epicurus, was often misunderstood. The general understanding or opposition against Epicureanism was that the Epicureans were only for pleasure, but by the time More was writing, Erasmus, More and Lorenzo Valla, many Renaissance philosophers, they were challenging this narrow definition of Epicureanism, and in fact the Italian philosopher Lorenzo Valla wrote a book on pleasure where he praised Epicurean philosophy, and the understanding of Epicurean philosophy was that it did not only allow sensual pleasure or indulgence in pleasure, but actually suggested that one should restrict the enjoyment of pleasure as much as possible. For they never dispute of the felicity or blessedness, but they join in unto the reasons of philosophy certain principles taken out of religion, without the which to the investigation of true felicity they think reason of itself weak and imperfect. That is, principles of religion came to be applied to the principles of philosophy. And here from time to time I will be referring to another translation and edition of More's Utopia, which is by George M. Logan, edited by George M. Logan and translated by Robert M. Adams. I do not know whether you are seeing a mirror image or the actual image. This is the most recent translation of Utopia in modern English, and I would have happily prescribed this for you, but it is not easily available. I mean, it may be available on Amazon, but it will be expensive for you. So unlike the Wordsworth Classics edition, which is commonly available. Now this book comes in the series of Cambridge Texts in the History of Political Thought, and it contains introduction and notes by these authors, Logan and Adams, and they also published a much fuller version of this text with introduction and materials, notes, in which you find the Latin version of Utopia along with the English one. So the threefold classification which we are talking about, that good of the mind, goods of the body, and external goods, which here Robinson translates as goods of fortune, Adams translate it as external goods. So these three kinds of goods, this threefold classification of goods appears in Plato, Laws, and especially associated with Aristotle in his Nicomachean Ethics. Now the topics of virtue and pleasure are being discussed here as understood by the utopians, and these topics are found in Cicero's On the Supreme Good and Evil. So you may write down the sources that I am telling you. I first told you about Plato's Laws and Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, which talks about three types of goods, and the discussion of virtue and pleasure can be found in Cicero. So when Raphael says that the utopians conclude that the most important position is human happiness, then they are taking the Epicurean position. And the importance of Epicureanism, or the importance of the virtue of pleasure in Utopia, has been discussed by many critics. The source of all this is Lorenzo Valla's On the True and False Good. The original name of his book was On Pleasure. It was later given the name On the True and False Goods. So they have some religious principles which they invoke in their discussion of philosophy. What are these? That the soul is immortal and by the bountiful goodness of God ordained to felicity. Felicity means happiness. Now you can also translate this word as bliss, and therefore man is ordained by God to have bliss. So this happiness is not only material happiness but also spiritual happiness. That to our virtues and good deeds rewards be appointed after this life, the concept of reward and punishment after death, and to our evil deeds punishments. So soul is immortal, man is ordained to have felicity, and there are reward and punishments for our good or evil deeds. So these are religious principles, but the philosophers, they also accept these principles as guiding principles. Now these principles we find are common to Christianity, but they are not to be found in Epicurus. So in Epicurean philosophy these principles are not to be found, because Epicurus maintained the indifference of the gods and the mortality of the soul. So unlike Plato or the Neoplatonists, Epicurus did not believe in the mortality of the soul. So ancient philosophy was divided on the question of immortality of the soul, and the Renaissance Neoplatonist Pico della Mirandola wrote on this question of the immortality of the soul. So the utopians seem to have accepted contrary principles. On the one hand, Epicurean philosophy, which does not believe in immortality of the soul. On the other hand, the three religious principles, among which there is the principle of the immortality of the soul as well. So these principles are very similar to Christian principles. Now the immortality of the soul was accepted as a dogma by the Roman Catholic Church in 1513. But if these principles were condemned and disannulled, then without any delay they pronounced no man to be so foolish which would not do all his diligence and endeavour to obtain pleasure by right or wrong, only avoiding this inconvenience that the less pleasure should not be a let or hindrance to the bigger, or that he laboured not for that pleasure which would bring after it displeasure, grief and sorrow. So if the religious principles were removed, if they were not there, then men would seek only pleasure. And in seeking pleasure, they would follow only two principles. One is that the lesser pleasure should not prevent one from having the greater pleasure. The second principle is that such pleasure should not be pursued which would bring displeasure in its wake. These rules are those from Epicurus. Epicurus' rule for choosing between competing pleasures. The rule finds perhaps its most influential statement in Cicero's dialogue on the supreme good and evil, where the Epicurean Torquatus explains that the wise man always holds to this principle of selection. He rejects pleasure to secure other greater pleasures, or else he endures pains to avoid worse pain. So you may just write down that the source of the principle to be followed where there are competing pleasures is Epicurus' philosophy, which was formulated later by also by Cicero in his On the Supreme Good and Evil. Is it clear?
Yes.
Good. If you have any doubt, you can stop and ask me. Now the discussion of virtue. They think not felicity to rest in all pleasure, but only in that pleasure that is good and honest, and that hereto, as to perfect blessedness, our nature is allured and drawn even of virtue, whereto only they that be of the contrary opinion do attribute felicity. So, we have here two opinions. One is that men are always pulled towards greater pleasure, but the utopians do not think that men should pursue all pleasure, but only that pleasure which is good and honest. And therefore, to decide which pleasures are good and honest, men must have an idea of virtue. For they define virtue to be life ordered according to nature, and that will be hereunto ordained of God. Now, those who believe that men should not pursue all pleasure, but only good and honest pleasure, are contradicted by those who think that all pleasure is only natural. So we have two opinions regarding the pursuit of pleasure. So the utopians reject the claim that purely rational and mundane considerations provide sufficient sanction for moral behavior. In this respect too, they differ from Epicurus, who thought that the mental pleasure of moral actions and the fear of detection in wrongdoing provided adequate incentives to virtue. So those who follow the first opinion, that is only good and uh, proper virtuous pleasure should be pursued, good and useful, good and honest pleasure should be pursued, they go against Epicurus, because Epicurus did not consider that men need to discuss virtue, because the mental pleasure of moral action and detection of wrongdoing, that should provide men with sufficient warning. Which means that Epicurus thought that men would naturally be propelled towards virtuous action, which of course others did not think, right? Who are the others? The Stoics, of course. So those who follow the second position is that of the Stoics, who declared that virtue constitutes happiness whether it leads to pleasure or not. Indeed, that a man who is enduring great misery may derive happiness from his knowledge of his own virtuous behavior. As the following marginal clause points out, the utopian's definition of virtue is also Stoic. So here the Stoic position is described, the idea that a man would feel pleasure in his own virtuousness or in his own virtue, even though they do not derive any physical pleasure, or they deprive themselves of physical pleasure. So that is the Stoic position. So the definition of virtue here for the Utopians is a Stoic definition, for they define virtue to be life ordered according to nature, and that we be hereunto ordained of God, and that he doth follow the course of nature, which in desiring and refusing things is ruled by reason. Which means that the Stoics believe that nature always provided right reason. Throughout the ensuing discussion, reason has the sense of right reason, the faculty that, according to a conception passed by the Stoics to the Middle Ages and Renaissance, enables human beings to distinguish right and wrong with instinctive clarity, that is, to apprehend the natural law. So the Stoics believe that naturally or intuitively men would know what is right and what is wrong, and their reason would always be right reason, because it would always point towards what is right. Now this position we find in Seneca. The Stoic Seneca took the same position. Our motto is live according to nature, but it is quite contrary to nature to torture the body. Philosophy calls for plain living, but not for penance. So Seneca, who was considered in the Renaissance to be a very important Stoic philosopher, along with Marcus Aurelius. More also here borrows from Seneca when he makes the Utopians partly follow the Stoic belief that nature leads to right reason. Therefore, even very nature, say they, prescribeth to us a joyful life, that is to say, pleasure as the end of all our operations. And they define virtue to be life ordered according to the prescription of nature, but in that nature doth allure and provoke men, one to help another to live merrily, which surely she does not without a good cause, for no man is so far above the lot of man's state or condition that nature doth cark and care for him only, which equally favoureth all that be comprehended under the communion of one shape, form and fashion. Verily she commended thee to use diligent circumspection, that thou do not seek for thine own commodities, that thou procure others in commodities. So this is also Stoic belief or Stoic faith, that while men pursue their own pleasure, they should not be the cause of other men's unhappiness. Therefore, you see that uh, the Epicureans, they also suggest that pleasure is the ultimate goal of life, and Stoics also suggest that pleasure is the end of all our operations. But there are differences of nuances. That is, the Stoics, they often also uphold asceticism, which the Epicureans do not. But the Epicureans, without proclaiming asceticism, they follow a very virtuous life. So here, but to go about to let another man have his pleasure, to let means to deprive another man of his pleasure, whilst thou procurest thine own, that is open wrong. So as we saw that this is also a Stoic position, that while you pursue your pleasure, you do not be the cause of another person's displeasure. Contrariwise, to withdraw something from thyself to give to others, that is a point of humanity and gentleness, which never taketh away so much commodity as it bringeth again. For it is recompensed with the return of benefits and the conscience of the good deed, with the remembrance of the thankful love and benevolence of them to whom thou hast done it, doth bring more pleasure to thy mind than that which thou hast withholden from thyself would have brought to thy body. So here the allusion is to charity. That is, when you give away something to other from which you yourself could have derived a lot of pleasure, but instead of consuming it yourself, you give it away to others. So that is a point of humanity and gentleness. And the consequence of this is that you get a lot of benefit in return. What is the benefit? That is, you have the conscience of the good deed that you are doing and of your benevolence. Then here we have, now this idea of charity, you can well identify it with the Christian principle of charity. So the philosophy of the utopians is a mix of Epicurean, Stoic and Christian philosophy. Next we come to the definition of pleasure. Pleasure they call every motion and state of the body or mind wherein man hath naturally delectation. Appetite they join to nature, and that not without a good cause. So pleasure is of three types: every motion and state of the body or mind. So it could be physical, it could be mental, it could be emotional. So this is where we come to a definition of pleasure, which we find in Plato's Laws and Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. Both, not laws, Philebus. Appetite join us to nature. So here they make a distinction between physical pleasure and mental pleasure. For like as not only the senses, but also right reason coveteth whatsoever is naturally pleasant, so that it may be gotten without wrong or injury, not letting or debarring a greater pleasure, nor causing painful labor. So you remember the two principles where there are competing pleasures. These are Epicurean principles. That is, you do not deprive yourself of a greater pleasure because of pursuing a lesser pleasure. That is the first principle. And you should not pursue any pleasure which later leads to pain. Even so, those things that men by vain imagination do feign against nature to be pleasant, as though it lay in their powers to change the things, as they do the names of things. All such pleasures they believe to be of so small help and furtherance to felicity, that they count them as a great latent hindrance, because that in whom they have once taken place, all his mind they possess with a false opinion of pleasure. So, some pleasures should not be pursued because they lead to small felicity. Why? Because such pleasures lead to more and more false opinion of pleasure. So these are not pleasure in the real sense or in the true sense. Why? Because true pleasure would be would raise one both mentally and emotionally to a higher level, and only the pleasure which only satisfies some physical appetite, that will be deemed a false pleasure, because it will not lead one to a higher felicity. So so this discourse is largely derived from Plato and Aristotle, as we already pointed out, Plato's Philebus and Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. Now, what are these false pleasures? So here we have a catalogue of false pleasures. In this counterfeit kind of pleasure they put them that I speak of before, which the better gowns they have on, the better men they think themselves. That is, the utopians do not use fancy dress or a fine dress. So the people who think that if they have a better gown, a better dress, then they are better men. In that which thing they do twice are, for they be no less deceived in that they think their gown the better than they be in that they think themselves the better. For if you consider the profitable use of the garment, why should wool of a finer spun thread be thought better than the wool of a coarse spun thread? Yet they, as though the one did pass the other by nature, and not by their mistaking, advance themselves, and think the price of their own persons thereby greatly increased. How can fine garment or fine thread be better than coarse thread? If we consider only profitability or utility, then a coarse thread may provide you with more warmth than fine thread. And how can your body or how can you yourself be more valuable just because you are wearing fine garment or garment made of fine thread? So these are fallacies or errors, and it is also illogical to think that if another person has a bare head or a bowed knees, then you enjoy some pleasure, which means that the pride and vanity leads you to a false, pride and vanity lead you to a false sense of pleasure. And here More is criticizing through Raphael the idea of nobility or noble birth to be a great felicity. So what are the false pleasures? First, the pleasure in having dressed in fine garments. Second, the pleasure derived from noble birth. So like Erasmus in the Praise of Folly, More here also criticizes noble birth. So what is the pleasure that you derive if somebody bows in front of you, and if one bares his head? That is, when anybody meets a nobleman, then one has to bow and take off his cap. And though their ancestor left them not 1 foot of land, or else they themselves have pieced it against the walls, yet they think themselves not the less noble therefore of 1 hair. So their ancestors may have left them bankrupt and have wasted all his lands and nothing is left for the next generation. But even then the next generation, instead of being angry with their ancestors, they praise them because from their ancestors they have got their noble birth. So More suggests that this noble birth is of no use because your ancestors have left you penniless or landless. So what is the point of praising them? The third false pleasure is that in the use of precious stones or gems, and they think themselves almost gods if they chance to get an excellent one, especially of that kind which in that time of their own countrymen is had in highest estimation. For one kind of stone keepeth not his price, still in all countries and at all times. So all stones are not precious or considered very valuable in all countries. Such care they take lest a counterfeit stone should deceive their eyes instead of a right stone. But why shouldst thou not take even as much pleasure in beholding a counterfeit stone, which thine eye cannot discern from a right stone? They should both be of like value to thee, even as to the blind man. So More says that, through Raphael, that people think that the true gems, the right stone, is very precious, and the false stone, which is an imitation, which is not the valuable stone, that is useless. But you can know which one is true and which one is false only if you are an expert. But if you are not an expert and if you do not know, then you may as well enjoy your false stone for many years without knowing. So what is the point in getting getting a precious stone? And there is an anecdote given by the editor Logan in the other text that I am reading from time to time, that More had given his wife a necklace of false stones and told her that these are all precious stones, and she used them very happily, believing them to be very precious. Now you may think that More was cheating his wife, but he was actually pursuing an experiment in moral philosophy, that if you believe something to be precious and hold it dear, then you get the same happiness even if it is a counterfeit, even if it is not the real thing. So if the point is getting happiness or pleasure, then whether the stone is true or false, that is immaterial. Then Raphael tells the story of a miser who hides his treasure, and for 10 years he did not enjoy it, gold or whatever, his treasure. But then someday a thief steals it, and then he feels miserable. So Raphael says that what is the point, because you did not enjoy it for all these years, and now that the thief has taken it, you cannot enjoy it either. So it is the same. You could not enjoy the treasure at any rate, in any case. So this is also a foolish pleasure to have superfluous riches. So that is the fourth in the catalogue. And then to these so foolish pleasures they join dicers, whose madness they know by hearsay and not by use. That is, those who gamble, dicers who play dice, that is, they gamble. It is called a kind of madness. Hunters also and hawkers, for what pleasure is there in casting the dice upon a table, which thou hast done so often that if there were any pleasure in it, yet the obtuse might make thee weary thereof. So by throwing the dice on the table, if you derived any pleasure, then by doing it frequently, it leaves you weary. That is, you get tired of gambling. You do not find much pleasure later. And similarly, the utopians do not like hunting or hawking, that is hunting with a hawk. So what greater pleasure is there to be felt when a dog follows the hare than when a dog follows the dog? For one thing is done in both, that is to say running. So whether dogs are running or whether dogs are chasing a hare, what is the difference? Because all you see in action is a dog running. So if you find pleasure in that, then you make a dog run. Don't indulge in hunting. Then he goes on to say that if you find pleasure in the fact that the dog kills the hare and tears it apart, if you find a pleasure in that kind of cruel activity, then you should be rather moved to pity seeing such an innocent creature being killed, or you become cruel and unmerciful. So the utopians count hunting the lowest, the vilest and most abject part of butchery, and the other parts of it more profitable and more honest, as bringing much more commodity, in that they kill beasts only for necessity. So here we find a criticism of hunting, and More wrote a Latin poem in which he described a hare being killed by a dog pursuing it. So utopians kill animals only for necessity, not for pleasure. Hunting is killing animals for pleasure. Whereas the hunter seeketh nothing but pleasure of the silly and woeful beasts, slaughter and murder. The which pleasure in beholding death they think doth rise in the very beasts, either of a cruel affection of mind, or else to be changed in continuance of time into cruelty by long use of so cruel a pleasure. So if people indulge in hunting for a long time, then they would gradually become very cruel. So we will continue with this discussion of pleasure among the utopians, but I will take a 5 minutes break. I will make myself a cup of tea. Do you have any question right now?
No, sir.
Okay, so can I take a break for 2 minutes? Then the discussion of different kinds of pleasure. So this catalogue of false pleasures is just finished, and Raphael goes on to talk about how the utopians divide pleasure into different types. The pleasure of the body, they make diverse kinds of pleasures. For some they attribute to the soul and some to the body. To the soul they give intelligence and that delectation that cometh of the contemplations of truth. Hereunto is joined the pleasant remembrance of the good life past. Here Ralph Robinson omits the phrase that follows, and the sure hope of future happiness. So the pleasure of the soul consists of memory of past happiness and consideration or thinking or thought about future happiness. So next they speak about pleasure of the body. The pleasure of the body they divide into two parts. The first is when delectation is sensibly felt and perceived, which many times chanceth by the renewing and refreshing of those parts which our natural heat drieth up. This cometh by meat and drink. So refreshment leads to refreshment of the body also. That is, eating and drinking means that those parts which get dry, you make them moist again through eating and drinking. Like I am having tea now. So some pleasure consists of refreshing the body. So this is bodily pleasure. And sometimes while those things be expulsed and voided, whereof is in the body over great abundance, the pleasure is felt when we do our natural easement, or when we be doing the act of generation, or when the itching of any part is eased with rubbing or scratching. Sometimes pleasure riseth, exhibiting to any member nothing that it desireth, not taking from it any pain that it feeleth, which nevertheless tickleth and moveth our senses with a certain secret efficacy, but with a manifest motion turneth them to it, as is that which cometh of music. So the physiological pleasures of voiding the body of something, or during generation, that is during copulation, I suppose more is referring to orgasm, and rubbing the body when it is itching, so scratching and tickling the body. These are bodily pleasures which are of the most vile type. Now and then pleasure arises not from restoring a deficiency or discharging an excess, but from something that affects and excites our senses with a hidden but unmistakable force. So the pleasure that we derive from music, that is also considered by More as a bodily pleasure. The pleasure rises exhibiting to any member nothing that it desires, nor taking from it any pain that it feels, which nevertheless tickles and moves our senses with a certain secret efficacy. Here More is talking about the pleasure of music, which does not take away from us anything, nor brings anything in addition to us, but it just tickles our senses. So I am a little surprised that More seems not to have a very good impression about music, but I do not know, it may not be More's opinion, because we have to remember that More also wants to present the utopians as bizarre, as a little strange in some of their thinking, in some of their values. The second part of the bodily pleasure, they say, is that which consisted and rested in the quiet and upright state of the body, and that truly is every man's own proper health, intermingled and disturbed with no grief. So here the idea presented is that health is a great pleasure, and this position or this view that having great health is having great pleasure is a view represented by Plato in the Republic. Not everybody supported this view, foreseeing that in the second, let me see, for this, if it not be lated nor assaulted with no grief, is delectable of itself, though it be moved with no external or outward pleasure. The view that health is a great pleasure, even though it seems that nothing is added to the body, or it does not lead to anything new. And it being once taken away, there is no place left for any pleasure, for to be without grief, not having health, that they call unsensibility and not pleasure. So if health is taken away, then there cannot be any pleasure. The utopians have long ago rejected and condemned the opinion of them which said that steadfast and quiet health ought not therefore to be counted a pleasure, because they say it cannot be presently and sensibly perceived and felt by some outward motion. The utopians refuted the critics of this view, who think that simply having health is not a pleasure. For seeing that in sickness is grief, which is a mortal enemy to pleasure, even as sickness is to health, why should not then pleasure be in the quietness of health? The utopians argue that since sickness brings discomfort, displeasure, therefore simply having health quietly, why that should not be considered as pleasure? So in this respect, the utopians they follow Plato's views in the Republic. Now the utopians, they emphasize pleasures of the mind over pleasures of the body. Page 92. They embrace chiefly the pleasures of the mind. For them they count the chiefest and most principal of all. The chief part of them, they think, doth come of the exercise of virtue and conscience of good life. So this is a kind of repetition. More had already defined through Raphael the pleasures of the body and pleasures of the mind. So simply having a good conscience and exercising virtue, these are considered pleasures of the mind. Among the pleasures of the body, we have already seen that they emphasize good health. Therefore, like as it is a wise man's part rather to avoid sickness than to wish for medicines, and rather to drive away and put to flight careful griefs than to call for comfort, so it is much better not to need this kind of pleasure than thereby to be eased of the contrary grief. So it is better not to have a pleasure which might later lead to grief. The which kind of pleasure if any man take for his felicity, that man must needs grant that then he shall be in most felicity, if he live that life which is led in continual hunger, thirst, itching, eating, drinking, scratching and rubbing. That is, if man derives bodily pleasure from these vile activities like scratching, rubbing and eating and so on, so then they will be continuously suffering from hunger, thirst and itching, because they will always look for satisfaction of these desires, and these are the basest pleasures. These doubtless be the basest pleasures of all, as unpure and unperfect, for they never come but accompanied with their contrary griefs. So any pleasure, or particularly bodily pleasure, which by satisfying which you enjoy it so much that when it is absent then you feel grief, then such pleasure always leads to dissatisfaction or pain. The best example is scratching. So when someone has an itch, he would scratch it, but the more one scratches it, the more one wants to do it further, and finally one ends up in giving an irritation to the skin, and therefore this pleasure leads to pain and nothing else. So this is a kind of a symptomatic view that bodily pleasures, they do not lead to ultimate happiness. For it beginneth before the pleasure and endeth not until the pleasure die with it. So this desire, bodily desire, that do not lead to satisfaction. But beauty, strength, nimbleness, these as peculiar and pleasant gifts of nature they make much of. But those pleasures that we received by the ears, the eyes and the nose, which nature willeth to be proper and peculiar to man, these pleasures, I say, they accept and allow as certain pleasant rejoicings of life. So beauty, strength, nimbleness and aesthetic pleasures which one derive with the help of the senses, eye, nose and so on, these they consider to be. So more or less this is how the discussion on pleasure is carried out, and we see that the utopian's view of pleasure is a mix of the Epicurean, the Stoic and the Christian. Do you have any questions?
No, sir.
Then the next discussion which ends this chapter is about education again, and the kind of books that the utopians read. And this will be largely a reference to Greek books, Greek learning and some Latin, because as we are told by More that Raphael Hythloday had greater Greek knowledge than Latin. So when he went to Utopia, he took with him more Greek books than Latin. When they had heard me speak of the Greek literature or learning, for in Latin there was nothing that I thought they would greatly allow besides historians and poets. So Raphael does not have a great esteem of Latin literature besides historians and poets, and the utopians, they were very virtuous mostly, and therefore they won't allow much of Latin literature which was scurrilous and scandalous. They made wonderful, earnest and important suit unto me that I would teach and instruct them in that tongue and learning. So they wanted Raphael to teach them Greek. I began therefore to read unto them at the first truly more because I would not seem to refuse the labour, than that I hoped that they would anything profit therewith. So he did not initially believe that the utopians would be able to learn Greek. So as you know that to the English at least, Greek is proverbially difficult. So there is this proverb or this idiom, what you are saying is Greek to me. That is, I do not understand what you are saying because the English people knew very little Greek, unlike people on the continent where Greek was much more taught and learned. But in the Renaissance, some Greek scholars, Englishmen who went to Italy and learned Greek from the Byzantine scholars, came back to England and started teaching Greek at Oxford. For example, Czech and Lascaris and some other humanists who knew Greek very well. And More had the opportunity of learning Greek from all the important Greek teachers of his time. And therefore he had a very high opinion about Greek and considered Greek literature and learning to be much superior to that of Latin. Particularly in the field of philosophy, the Romans did not contribute anything new because they only kind of popularized the Greek schools of thought. So Cicero wrote on the different kinds of Greek philosophy, and he claimed himself to be a skeptic, academic skepticism. He wrote a book called Academica where he expressed his views of academic skepticism. But basically he was a timid follower of Stoicism, and also sometimes wrote on Epicureanism. Skepticism was difficult and extreme proposition because the skeptics did not believe in anything. They questioned everything. Therefore, we do not find in Cicero an ardent skepticism, even though he claimed to follow Platonic school of skepticism, which was called academic skepticism because it was taught in the Platonic Academy. So the utopians began to learn Greek. I perceived, incontinent by their diligence, that my labor should not be bestowed in vain, for they began so easily to fashion their letters, so plainly to pronounce the words, so quickly to learn by heart, and so surely to rehearse the same, that I marvelled at it, saving that the most part of them were fine and chosen wits, and of ripe age picked out of the company of the learned men, which not only of their own free and voluntary will, but also by the commandment of the council undertook to learn this language. So the best scholars, they were commanded by the council to learn Greek from Hythloday. Therefore, in less than 3 years' space, there was nothing in the Greek tongue that they lacked. They were able to read good authors without any stay, if the book were not false. So this kind of describes the difficulty about learning Greek. What is the difficulty? That first of all, people have to learn a new script, because as you know that the Greek script is different from the Roman script. So learning a new script and then learning a new language which is very different, that constitutes the difficulty of the language. And secondly, uh, it is altogether a different cultural tradition, because as you may know that the Byzantine Empire, or the so-called Greek Empire, its cultural ethos was different from that of the Roman West, and even its religion was a little different, though it was Christianity, but it was different from the kind of Christianity or the version of Christianity practiced in Rome or practiced in the West. And there were many meetings over the differences between the Eastern and the Western Church, and these differences could not be resolved. And ultimately the Church separated from the Western Church, and today we call it the Greek Orthodox Church, as different from the Western Church. And similarly, we have the Russian Orthodox Church, so which is, I suppose, a kind of variation of the Greek Orthodox religion. And these churches, they have some differences with the Western understanding of Christianity. So learning Greek meant not only learning the pagan culture, the cultural ethos of the ancient Greek and Byzantine period, which is very different from the Roman ethos, but also following a different kind of interpretation about life, about religion, about spirituality and all that. And therefore learning Greek was considered very difficult for a Western person. But it was taken up with great zeal in countries like Italy and France after the fall of Constantinople. And in England, Erasmus, More, and a few other, John Colet, and a few other, they revived the practice of Greek learning. Erasmus had learned Greek from John Colet, who was the Dean of St. Paul's and who also founded the St. Paul's School, in which Erasmus helped him with the syllabus. And More also learned from Sir John Check, the other great Greek scholar. So here in this book, More describes the utopians as learning Greek thoroughly, and Raphael also comments that the utopians could learn Greek so quickly and so well because their own language is somewhat similar and probably was derived from Greek in ancient past. And More provides the reader with the alphabet of the utopians, and Raphael comments that their alphabet has some similarity with Greek alphabet. Therefore, consciously and deliberately, through Raphael, More presents Greek culture and ethos and Greek learning as superior to Latin and as something to which the utopians were attracted. This kind of learning, as I suppose, they took so much the sooner because it is somewhat allied to them. It is allied to them. For I think that this nation took their beginning of the Greeks because their speech, which in all their points is not much unlike the Persian origin, the Persian tongue, keepeth diverse signs and tokens of the Greek language in the names of their cities and of their magistrates. So the Persians were in touch with the Greeks, and they had a lot of exchange, and therefore Raphael suggests that utopians who had their language derived from Persian, they were also close to Greek culture and language. They have of me For when I determined to enter into my fourth voyage, I cast into ship in the state of merchandise a pretty fardel of books, because I intended to come again rather never than shortly. So here Raphael says that when I set out for Utopia, I thought that I would never come back. So instead of coming back shortly, I would rather stay on in Utopia, and for that reason I took with me a great number of, and the books that Raphael brought to Utopia, the Utopians had access to only those books, and any book that Raphael did not bring, the Utopians could not get that book. So here we see in the description of these books a kind of basic knowledge about Greek language and culture, which Raphael, or which More through Raphael wants the reader to think is necessary or would contribute to such knowledge. So what books he brought? I say of me the most part of Plato's works, more of Aristotle's, also Theophrastus of plants, that is Theophrastus' book on botany. But in diverse places, which I am sorry for, imperfect, that is the book was not in a good condition. For whilst we were ashipboard, a marmoset chanced upon the book as it was negligently laid by, which wantonly playing therewith, plucked out certain leaves and tore them in pieces. A monkey got hold of the book and destroyed some pages of the book on the ship, and therefore some knowledge was lost. So I do not know, probably More is alluding to the fragility of knowledge, that mankind can amass knowledge with great toil, but in the history of civilization, much of our ancient knowledge get destroyed for various reasons, and then we have to reinvent the wheel again and again, because we tend to lose the knowledge. Of them that have written the grammar, they have only Lascaris. Lascaris was a writer of Greek grammar. For Theodorus I carried not with me, nor never a dictionary, but Hesius and Dioscorides. So he did not have Theodorus, but he brought the dictionaries by Hesius and Dioscorides. Now in the Renaissance there was an attempt by writers to compile Greek dictionaries, and it is those dictionaries which became the ultimate source for people's knowledge of the Greek language. And all these great intellectual endeavors, they could finally find a place in our history of language and literature by the efforts of Aldus Manutius, an Italian, who began to print these books. So in the Renaissance, the important or the first editions of most books printed were called Aldine editions, that is from the name of Aldus Manutius, who had a press. They set great store by Plutarch's books. Plutarch is well known for his Moralia, and also for parallel, this is not exactly the name of the book, but parallel lives of Greek and Roman heroes or famous people. But the Moralia was the most significant significant book read in the Renaissance, and is the source of much of Renaissance literature. And they be delighted with Lucian's merry conceits and jests. The Roman writer Lucian, he is very significant because More and Erasmus both were full of praise of Lucian. Lucian wrote satires, and Erasmus's praise of folly praises uh, Lucian and practices the kind of satire praised by written by Lucian, and this book Utopia is also a kind of satire at times and is influenced by Lucian, because More had translated some works by Lucian, and therefore he held Lucian as a very important satirist. And here we see that the Utopians, they also praise Lucian. Of the poets, they have Aristophanes, Homer, Euripides and Sophocles in Aldus's small print. That is Aldus Manutius, I mentioned before. Of the historians, they have Thucydides, Herodotus and Herodian. Also my companion, Trisius Epinatus, carried with him physic books, certain small works of Hippocrates and Galenus's Microtechnique. Physic means medicine. So medical science was also held as very important in the Renaissance, and the Utopians also considered medical science to be very significant, very useful, and therefore the two known Greek authors of medical science were Hippocrates and Galen, or Galenus, the Latinate name. As you know that even today doctors take Hippocratic oath, that is the oath of doctors, which was originally conceived by Hippocrates. The which book they have in great estimation, that is Galen's Microtechnique. So these are the subjects. Philosophy is represented by Plato and Aristotle, botany by Theophrastus, and language by Lascaris, Hesius and Dioscorides, moral philosophy by Plutarch, literature by Aristophanes, Homer, Euripides and Sophocles, and history by Thucydides, Herodotus and Herodian, and medical science by Hippocrates and Galen. So in a nutshell, this is, we may say, a syllabus that any Renaissance student or learner would consider to be a significant part of knowledge that one must cover before anything else. And as you can see that here there is no Latin book. So these are only Greek books. Now the importance of medicine for the Utopians. For though there be almost no nation under heaven that hath less need of physics than they, yet this notwithstanding, physic is nowhere in greater honor. The Utopians have the least use of medicine among all nations of the earth, because they are very healthy. So even though they have the least use of medicine, yet they hold medicine in great honor, because they count the knowledge of it among the goodliest and most profitable parts of philosophy. For whilst they by the help of this philosophy search out the secret mysteries of nature, they think themselves to receive thereby not only wonderful great pleasure, but also to obtain great thanks and favor of the author and maker thereof. So the writers of these books of medicine, the Utopians considered them to be very thankful to these authors, whom they think, according to the fashion of other artificers, to have set forth the marvelous and gorgeous frame of the world for man, with great affection intentively to behold, whom only he had made of wit and capacity to consider and understand the excellency of so great a work. The Utopians thank these authors because they think that these authors are among the artificers or creators, inventors, who have made it possible for man to appreciate this world. Because the writers of medicine, they describe nature, they are natural philosophers, and therefore he beareth more goodwill and love to the curious and diligent beholder and viewer of his work, and marveller at the same, than he doth to him who is like a very brute beast without wit and reason, or as one without sense or moving, has no regard to so great and so wonderful a spectacle. So the natural philosophies and the natural philosophers, they describe nature, and therefore people who marvel at nature, who wonder at the knowledge about nature, these writers, they consider them to be worthy people rather than those people who are like animals or brutes who cannot appreciate nature. So this praise of natural philosophy is, I would say, an appreciation of knowledge about nature, or we may say science in today's term, because natural philosophy is science. So the importance of science, the importance of knowledge about nature was held to be significant by the writers, readers, and also by the utopians. The wits therefore of the utopians, inured and exercised in learning, be marvellous quick in the invention of feats helping anything to the advantage and wealth of life. So the utopians, they were marvellously quick, that is, they were very quick to learn anything new. And from Raphael's description of paper and printing, the utopians managed to discover on their own the making of paper and the printing press. Now, as you may know, that these were two great inventions in the Renaissance, the invention of paper and the printing press. And because of these inventions, we may say there was a boom in learning, there was an expansion in learning, because it was possible to disseminate printed books much quickly than the earlier practice of manuscripts, because manuscripts were copied by hand and were very tedious and needed a lot of time and care, whereas books were printed by machines and therefore could be printed in much large numbers, and therefore knowledge could be quickly disseminated. So just as today we are seeing an expansion of knowledge with the development of the internet, the World Wide Net, similarly in the Renaissance there was a sudden expansion of knowledge because of the development of the printing press and paper. So these two significant things find a mention here, and the utopians, by merely hearing from Raphael how paper was made, they finally discovered the technology of making paper and printing press. For when you showed to them Aldous' print in books of paper, and told them of the stuff whereof paper is made, and of the feat of graving letters, graving means engraving letters, speaking somewhat more than we could plainly declare, for there was none of us that knew perfectly either the one or the other, because neither Raphael nor his friends who were there, they knew the technologies very well. They forthwith very wittily conjectured the thing. That is, they could imagine, they could understand, or they could recreate, they could discover how paper can be manufactured or printing press can be devised. And whereas before they wrote only in skins, in barks of trees and in reeds, now they have attempted to make paper and to imprint letters. And though at the first it proved not all of the best, yet by often essaying the same, essaying means attempting the same, they shortly got the feat of both. So now they stopped writing on skins or on bark of trees, because now they could manufacture paper and they could write on papers, or they could print their books, and have so brought the matter about that if they had copies of Greek authors, they could lack no books, because from one copy they could now print many copies. But now they have no more than I rehearsed before, saving that by printing of books they have multiplied and increased the same into many thousands of copies. Unfortunately, their resources of books were limited to what Raphael brought to the country. And since Raphael brought only a limited number of books, so they had no other books than those, but they made thousands of copies of them. So here we see a representation of dissemination of knowledge, expansion of knowledge, which was a favorite theme with the humanists. And Raphael, of course, is the humanist represented here, who is erudite and well versed in Greek knowledge and culture, and like a humanist, he facilitates the dissemination of knowledge among utopians. Right, so we get the import of this section, the last section of the chapter. This is about dissemination of knowledge and copying of ancient books through printing, and thus it presents a core idea of humanism, a core idea of the Renaissance, we may say, which is the dissemination of knowledge. Now, what is particularly significant about this chapter, about Utopia, this book, is that More talks only about spread of Greek knowledge. And even though he belongs to the tradition of the West or to the Christian tradition, we do not find here mention of any Christian books, nor do we find here mention of much of Cicero or other books, even though we learn from critics and editors of this book that from time to time the ideas expressed here could be found also in Cicero, though mostly in Plato, Aristotle and other Greek philosophers. But Raphael does not mention any Roman author, any Roman philosopher. So he is quite dismissive of that culture. And if we ask what is the reason of this, because we might assume More to be a proponent of Christian knowledge, a proponent of Latin culture, then why does he dismiss all of those in this book? Then we realize that he has a plan. He wants to present Utopia as a pagan culture, and he wants to juxtapose the pagan culture of the Utopians vis-a-vis the Christian culture of England or the West. And therefore he does not mix things. He wants the reader to understand the contrary or the contradictory nature of these two systems. And Utopia is designed by More to be the other, as different from the Western tradition. And therefore we may imagine that the Greek tradition remained the other for the West. In spite of the Renaissance, in spite of the revival of Greek literature and philosophy, it always remained the other for the West. Very few people could read in Greek, and so they mostly read whatever was translated by the Christian fathers. Okay, so the influence of Greek culture and philosophy did not ever penetrate to the innermost consciousness of the Western people. Just a second. All right. So as I was saying that it did never penetrate into the innermost consciousness of the West or in the Western tradition. All right. So we stop here today. Let me know if you have any questions.